This is also a time of change for my family. King Charles had been prepared for difficult conversations, family disputes, and even public challenges to his authority. But nothing prepared him for the request placed before him that morning. Meghan had not simply asked to return to royal service. She had formally demanded control of a protected patronage belonging exclusively to Catherine, a role sealed by the late Queen, guarded by palace tradition, and forbidden from being transferred to anyone outside the direct working royal household. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat with private secretaries when the sealed submission arrived. He expected a proposal for charitable cooperation, a project to ease old tensions. Instead, the first page changed the room. The Queen's Covenant for Children and Families, a protected royal patronage, meaning a charitable responsibility assigned by the monarch, stood at the center of Meghan's demand. She wanted temporary control, though the role belonged to Catherine and could not be transferred without the king's approval. The monarch read the request once, then he read it again. Meghan's argument did not sound like an offer to help. It described the covenant as needing a recognized woman who could expand its reach beyond Britain, language suggesting Catherine was no longer capable of carrying its future. Charles understood why that mattered. The late Queen had entrusted the patronage to the princess as a sign of confidence, continuity, and duty. William delivered the news to Catherine in private. She listened without interrupting, but her composure changed when he admitted Meghan's submission had called the patronage vacant. Catherine repeated the word once. Vacant? The prince watched the hurt settle behind her restraint. Meghan had turned reduced public duty into evidence that she could be replaced. Charles felt a second shock when he studied the wording. Several phrases matched a restricted palace memorandum, including a dormant transfer clause. A rarely used rule explaining temporary stewardship during royal absence. That material was never meant for outside hands. Someone with knowledge of palace records had helped Meghan shape the claim. The request was no longer family ambition. It was an organized challenge. When the secretaries left, Charles removed his glasses and pressed his fingers against his forehead. She has crossed the boundary. Music, he whispered, the one she was warned never to approach. Before he could answer, William requested an immediate private audience. The future king arrived tense, carrying no papers, but certain who had supplied Meghan with the forbidden language. What began as an audacious request was becoming something far more dangerous, a struggle over Catherine's dignity, Meghan's unfinished royal ambitions, and Charles's ability to defend his family. Behind the formal title of the patronage stood three people carrying three very different wounds. Catherine saw it as a sacred promise made during the final years of Queen Elizabeth's life. Meghan viewed it as proof that the palace had denied her the platform she deserved. Charles saw both women standing on opposite sides of a family fracture he had never managed to repair. Now one protected role threatened to expose every resentment they had tried to bury. Catherine had earned the Queen's Covenant through years of work focused on children, stable families, and early development. The patronage was a royal charitable responsibility carried in the monarch's name, but the late Queen had never treated it as a decorative title. In a private written instruction, she described it as a lifelong duty and placed its future directly in the princess's hands. Meghan carried a different memory. She had once expected to lead a major Commonwealth initiative, meaning a charitable program connected to nations with historic ties to the crown. After leaving royal duties, she became convinced that opportunities meant for her had been redirected toward Catherine. During a tense conversation with Harry, she insisted the new request was not an attack. It was, she said, an attempt to reclaim work she had always been qualified to lead. Catherine felt the timing more deeply than the demand itself. She had been rebuilding her strength, returning carefully, and protecting her family while the country watched every step. Meghan had chosen that vulnerable moment to describe the role as needing stronger leadership. To the princess, that was not ambition alone. It was an attempt to turn suffering into weakness. William carried the hidden answer straight to Charles. The Queen's personal covenant allowed another working royal to offer temporary support, but neither the patronage's name nor its authority could be transferred while Catherine remained in service. The prince told his father that this was not a flexible tradition. It was a direct promise written to prevent exactly this kind of struggle. Camilla saw another danger. She warned Charles that an immediate refusal could be twisted into a public story about Meghan being blocked from helping vulnerable children. The Queen Consort understood the trap, approved the request, and betrayed Catherine, or reject it and risk appearing cruel. The king finally saw how carefully the claim had been designed. Catherine stood beside the cabinet, holding the Covenant's original silver emblem. She did not touch it. She simply told William that she would not fight Meghan in public for something the Queen had already placed in her care. The prince answered quietly. Catherine might not want a battle, but someone inside the old palace structure had already chosen one for her. To understand how Meghan gained the courage and the confidential knowledge to make such a demand, Charles would have to revisit one royal ceremony everyone had tried to forget. The attempt to seize Catherine's patronage did not begin with the letter Charles received. It began months earlier inside a crowded hall at St. James's Palace when one empty chair became more powerful than any speech delivered that evening. Catherine was absent. Meghan was watching from afar, and an old royal advisor made one careless remark about temporary succession. That sentence traveled across an ocean, entered the wrong conversation, and eventually returned to the king as a direct challenge. Princess Anne stepped forward that evening because Catherine could not attend. She delivered brief remarks on the princess's behalf, but she never claimed the role itself. At the annual covenant ceremony, the patronage's formal plans were presented to supporters. Catherine's empty chair remained untouched, a quiet sign that the position still belonged to her even in absence. Sir Malcolm Avery noticed the chair as well. The former palace advisor had helped draft the covenant's early administrative rules, meaning the private instructions governing how patronage could be supported or protected. After the ceremony, he spoke freely with several guests about what might happen if Catherine could not maintain a full public schedule. That conversation should have ended there. It did not. Avery told an American charity executive that a dormant continuity clause allowed the monarch to appoint a temporary steward. The clause was a rarely used rule designed to keep the work moving during a royal absence. Days later, the executive repeated that detail during a private call with Meghan. She heard opportunities where others had heard procedures. Meghan focused on the empty chair. She argued that the palace was preserving appearances while the patronage needed active leadership. To her, Catherine's absence proved that the covenant required someone ready to take it beyond Britain. Yet, Catherine later learned that photographs of that chair had circulated among Meghan's advisors. The princess felt something colder than anger. Her difficult absence had been studied as an opening. William uncovered the deeper plan. One of Meghan's legal consultants had contacted Avery 3 times after the ceremony asking for details about the covenant's status, finances, and royal insignia. The prince also discovered what the submission had hidden. Any temporary steward had to be a senior working royal acting under Catherine's authority. Meghan's team had removed that restriction from its argument. Charles summoned Avery for a private account. The advisor entered carrying a walking stick and admitted that his careless remark had opened the door. When he left, he forgot the stick beside the chair. The king stared at it in silence, realizing that one man's loose words had become another person's weapon. Charles ordered the request kept secret until he could speak to Meghan directly, but she was already in London expecting negotiation. By then, secretaries and legal language were no longer enough. The confrontation had already begun. There were no cameras inside the room, no public statements, and no smiling relatives positioned between them. Only Charles, Meghan, and the protected name of the woman who was not yet present. The king entered intending to hear an explanation. Meghan arrived prepared to make a case. But within minutes, the conversation stopped sounding like a discussion about charity. It became a reckoning over rejection, entitlement, music, loyalty, and the royal future both believed they were defending. Charles refused Meghan's request to bring advisors into the meeting. Clarence House was the king's London residence, and he wanted the matter handled as a family dispute before it hardened into an official royal crisis. Meghan accepted the condition, but she did not soften her argument. She said the covenant had been limited by caution, and that she could bring international donors, global partnerships, and attention the palace had failed to secure. Meghan spoke with controlled confidence. She insisted the work mattered more than tradition, and argued that children should not suffer because the royal family feared change. Charles listened until he asked the question she had avoided from the beginning. Why had Catherine not been consulted before the application was filed? Meghan answered without hesitation. She said permission was not needed from the person whose inactivity had created the need for intervention. Charles pushed his chair back. The restraint vanished from his voice. You are asking for what was never yours and using Catherine's pain to justify taking it. The king reminded her that reduced duty was not surrender. Catherine had stepped back to recover, not to abandon the promise placed in her care. Meghan then revealed the belief driving her claim. During a private recorded conversation with Harry months earlier, she had said Queen Elizabeth once considered giving her a connected Commonwealth role. The Commonwealth was a voluntary group of nations, linked by shared history and cooperation. Meghan now described the covenant request as the correction of an opportunity the institution had quietly denied her. Charles answered with a truth she had never expected to hear. The late Queen had considered several roles, but she personally removed Meghan's name from the covenant succession framework. The rules identifying who could temporarily support or inherit authority. After concerns arose about mixing royal power with independent commercial interests, Meghan's expression changed. She asked whether Catherine had known. The door opened before Charles could respond. Catherine entered with William and answered that she had learned only that morning. The princess did not accuse Meghan of jealousy. She asked one simple question. Why had her work been described as abandoned rather than temporarily reduced? Meghan could not answer without exposing the wound beneath the strategy. Charles ended the meeting with a final order. No decision would be issued until the covenant's authority had been reviewed by the two royals empowered to interpret the Queen's private instructions. Meghan had made her demand. Catherine had faced it. And the king now had to decide whether royal power belonged to pressure or to a promise made in silence. The final decision did not rest with public popularity, charitable ambition, or even Charles's personal sympathy. Hidden beneath the patronage's ceremonial language was a private instruction carrying the moral authority of the late Queen. It named Catherine, defined the meaning of her stewardship, and warned future monarchs against allowing the role to become a prize in a family competition. When Charles finally heard those words read aloud, Meghan's request stopped appearing ambitious. It appeared dangerously calculated. Charles met Princess Anne and the keeper of the Privy Seal inside a quiet Windsor library. The keeper was the official responsible for protecting the monarch's most important formal documents and approvals. Anne had been present when Queen Elizabeth accepted the covenant's final private instructions, and she understood that the document was not symbolic. It was a direct command meant to survive changing reigns, family pressure, and personal ambition. Anne began reading. The covenant had been designed to operate across decades, not across convenient public schedules. Illness, pregnancy, family responsibility, or reduced appearances could never be treated as surrender. Catherine's authority remained intact because the role had been entrusted to her character, not merely to her availability. Charles listened carefully, knowing that this detail destroyed the central argument behind Meghan's claim. Charles admitted what still troubled him. A harsh rejection could deepen Harry's estrangement and push his younger son even further from the family. Anne did not dismiss that fear. She asked whether protecting one damaged relationship was worth sacrificing Catherine's trust and ignoring their mother's final instructions. The king remembered promising to defend both of his sons' families. Yet neutrality had not brought peace. It had allowed Catherine's restraint to be treated as weakness and Meghan's pressure to grow into entitlement. Charles now understood that refusing to choose was itself a choice. And Catherine had been paying the price. Anne then read the most decisive clause. The patronage could never pass to anyone who had left official royal service or intended to combine royal authority with independent branding. She also revealed through a documented palace record that Meghan's representatives had requested permission to use the covenant's royal seal on international fundraising material before the formal application even reached Charles. The seal was the official emblem proving that work operated under crown authority. Meghan's team had prepared for victory before the king had even been asked. Charles stood near the window while Anne read the final paragraph. When she finished, he closed the curtains himself. There will be no negotiation over my mother's promise, he said. Camilla found him alone later and asked whether he was prepared for the consequences. The monarch answered that a greater danger would be teaching the family that pressure mattered more than loyalty. Charles authorized the formal refusal. But before it reached Meghan, a suspended palace contact leaked the decision. The king had drawn his line. Yet the betrayal ensured that Meghan would experience the rejection not privately but as a humiliation waiting to explode. The refusal was only 6 paragraphs long, but its consequences spread through the royal household within minutes. Meghan's request was denied. Her access to the patronage's advisors was terminated. Every informal discussion connected to the covenant was frozen. Yet the most painful sentence was not legal or procedural. It stated that Catherine had never ceased to hold the role. In one line, the palace rejected Meghan's argument and exposed the personal judgment hidden beneath it. Charles's response confirmed that the Queen's covenant for children and families would remain permanently under Catherine's stewardship. Stewardship meant the formal duty to protect and lead the patronage in the monarch's name. The role was not vacant, dormant, or available for temporary reassignment. Palace officials were ordered to end every discussion with Meghan's external team and recover fundraising drafts carrying unauthorized versions of the covenant's emblem. Meghan received the decision inside her London residence. She read the final paragraph, placed her phone face down, and told Harry that the palace had chosen Catherine's image over children who needed global support. Her voice remained controlled, but humiliation sat beneath every word. The rejection had not merely blocked her proposal. It had declared that the entire claim rested on a false judgment of another woman's weakness. Harry asked the question she had hoped to avoid. Had she truly expected Charles to remove the patronage from Catherine? Meghan answered that she expected the king to recognize capability. That reply exposed the competition at the heart of the request. She had not viewed herself as temporary support. She had viewed the moment as a test of which woman deserved the greater royal platform. The fallout deepened almost immediately. A palace communications officer uncovered a prepared announcement titled "A New Global Chapter for the Queen's Covenant." The draft suggested Meghan's team had expected approval or planned to create enough public pressure to make refusal difficult. William then learned that a photographer had been booked outside a children's center, where Meghan intended to make her first unofficial appearance linked to the role. Catherine received the restored covenant schedule from her private secretary. She closed the folder without celebrating and asked that no palace statement attack Meghan. Children, she said, could not become props in a family struggle. The princess had regained control, but she refused to turn victory into revenge. Charles heard of Catherine's decision and fell silent. Her restraint moved him more deeply than anger could have. In that moment, the king knew the late queen had entrusted the patronage to the right person. Music. Then, the crisis escaped the palace. Images of Meghan arriving in London appeared online, and questions spread about the meeting she was never supposed to disclose. The rejection had ended her claim on paper, but only a private conversation between Charles and Catherine could decide whether the damage would harden into permanent bitterness. Charles expected Catherine to demand stronger protection, a public correction, or consequences for everyone who had assisted Meghan. Instead, when the two met without William, Camilla, secretaries, or legal advisors, the music princess asked for something that surprised him even more than the original claim. She did not want revenge. She wanted the patronage protected from becoming a weapon ever again. That request transformed the king's refusal from a temporary answer into a permanent royal settlement. Catherine arrived alone at Windsor and asked that no one join them. She did not want William's anger or palace strategy shaping what came next. The meeting mattered because the dispute had already gone beyond one rejected application. It had exposed how easily illness, reduced duty, and private pain could be twisted into evidence that a royal promise had expired. Charles apologized before she could begin. He admitted that Meghan's application should never have advanced far enough to force Catherine into defending a role Queen Elizabeth had already secured for her. The monarch knew his delay had created doubt where there should have been certainty, and the princess had carried the emotional cost of that hesitation. Catherine then admitted what had hurt most. Being described as inactive had reopened a fear she had never spoken aloud, that her reduced public presence had made the family see her as replaceable. Charles rejected that thought immediately. Vulnerability, he told her, had never erased years of service, loyalty, or the trust placed in her. Catherine still refused to answer pain with cruelty. She told the king that Meghan's attempted takeover seemed driven by a desperate need to prove that leaving royal life had not reduced her importance. The princess felt sadness for that need, even while recognizing the damage it had caused. Catherine asked for more than a refusal. She wanted the patronage charter rewritten so no future monarch could interpret illness, pregnancy, family duty, or temporary absence as abandonment. The charter was the formal document defining how the covenant must be governed. Protecting it would protect every future royal from the same kind of calculated challenge. Charles then revealed through a private documented instruction that he had considered removing Meghan's right to mention any historical link to the covenant. Catherine urged him not to turn protection into personal punishment. "Defend the institution," she said, "but do not feed another public war." Charles reached across the table and took her hand. He told her restraint must never again be mistaken for weakness, then signed the instruction, creating a permanent protective charter. As Catherine rose to leave, the king asked whether she could forgive Meghan. She answered that forgiveness might come privately, but trust could not be restored by pretending betrayal had never happened. The revised charter was sent for announcement. At that same moment, a leaked copy of Meghan's rejected application reached a major television newsroom. Catherine had stopped justice from becoming vengeance, but the public was about to be far less restrained. By sunrise, the conflict Charles had fought to contain behind palace doors was dominating Britain. The language of Meghan's request, Catherine's supposed inactivity, and the king's stunned response moved from private correspondence to breakfast broadcasts and crowded streets. Yet the public reaction was not shaped by constitutional clauses. It centered on one simple image: Catherine quietly returning to the work Meghan had attempted to claim without speaking a single hostile word. Palace officials confirmed that an unauthorized request involving a protected royal patronage had been rejected. A royal patronage was an official charitable role carried on behalf of the crown, giving its holder influence, visibility, and responsibility. The palace refused to publish Meghan's full submission or discuss the private family meeting, but that silence only intensified the debate. Broadcasters framed the crisis as a test of royal duty. Were these appointments lifelong promises built through service or powerful platforms that could be reassigned to whoever commanded greater international attention? The argument mattered because Catherine's temporary reduction in public work had now been used to challenge whether loyalty still carried more weight than visibility. Meghan felt the humiliation deepen with every headline. The coverage focused on her attempt to replace Catherine, not on the donors and global partnership she had proposed. Harry urged her to release the complete application and defend her motives. She refused. The most aggressive language would reveal that her team had treated the princess not as someone needing support, but as an obstacle ready to be removed. Catherine felt no triumph. She told her staff not to celebrate approval ratings or treat public sympathy as victory. The covenant, she insisted, had to return immediately to helping children and families. Her restraint stood in painful contrast to the leaked draft of Meghan's launch announcement, which described the patronage as entering more capable global hands. Charles answered that revelation with action. He authorized publication of the revised charter, the formal rules controlling the covenant. It permanently named Catherine as principal steward and allowed temporary support only from working royals personally chosen by her. The attempted loophole was closed. One newspaper captured the national mood with the front-page headline, "The patronage she could not take." Beneath it appeared Meghan, entering Clarence House beside Catherine, greeting families at a children's center. Later that morning, a crowd gathered outside the center in South London. When Catherine arrived, the applause became so loud that she stopped, visibly moved, and placed one hand over her heart. Britain had delivered its judgment, but Charles knew public emotion could not be the final word. As support gathered around Catherine, the king prepared one last statement, not to extend the scandal, but to end it with an unmistakable verdict. The world had seen the ambition, the pain, and the attempted seizure. Now the crown had to declare what it would remember after the noise disappeared. Charles' final decision was not delivered in anger. It came without insults, retaliation, or dramatic punishment, but its meaning was absolute. Meghan would not receive Catherine's patronage, would not represent it abroad, and would not use its royal identity for independent campaigns. The covenant would remain where Queen Elizabeth placed it. In defending that promise, the king finally answered a question that had haunted the monarchy for years: whether pressure could overpower loyalty. This time, it could not. Charles issued a formal declaration confirming Catherine as the permanent principal steward of the Queen's Covenant for Children and Families. The declaration was an official royal statement carrying the monarch's authority. It confirmed that the princess would hold the role for as long as she remained part of the working royal household. No temporary absence could create a vacancy, and no replacement could be appointed without her agreement. Catherine returned to the Covenant's headquarters and met the staff privately. She told them the role had never been about possession, status, or defeating another woman. It was about keeping a promise to families who depended on stability. The princess had survived an attempt to turn her vulnerability into weakness. Yet she refused to treat the outcome as a personal victory. Meghan left Britain without the announcement she had prepared. During a final recorded conversation with Harry, she admitted that she had underestimated how strongly the patronage was tied to Catherine and how firmly Charles would defend the late Queen's choice. Harry heard no anger in her voice. He heard disappointment, but also the first sign that she understood the boundary had become permanent. Charles ordered every unauthorized promotional draft destroyed. He also closed the dormant continuity clause, the rarely used rule that had allowed Meghan's team to argue for temporary control. No future claimant could use that loophole again. Sir Malcolm Avery was then removed from all advisory access to restricted patronage records, ending the internal channel that had made the strategy possible. Charles visited Catherine after her first full Covenant engagement. He did not mention Meghan, the leaked application, or the public backlash. He simply told the princess, "The promise is safe." Catherine answered, "Then the work can continue." That quiet exchange carried the final verdict. Meghan's failure did not prove that she lacked compassion or ability. It proved that royal service could not be claimed through ambition, publicity, or comparison. It had to be earned through trust, continuity, and sustained duty. Charles emerged with firmer authority. Catherine emerged with strength and dignity. The monarchy finally enforced a boundary it had avoided for too long. The attempted takeover was over. Meghan lost the claim. Catherine retained the patronage permanently, and the king proved that the crown's deepest promises were not available to whoever demanded them most forcefully. Visibility could attract attention, but only loyalty earned the crown's trust. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.